Season 2 of this channel ended with a promise. The rivals who shaped his life from the outside. The country that had to live with his legacy for 5 centuries after he was gone. Here's where that promise actually starts. 500 years after Vlad the Third died on a winter road, a very different kind of leader needed him again. Not a king looking for a scapegoat, like the story this channel told in its 4th episode. Not a novelist looking for a Gothic name, like the story this channel told in its 16th. A 20th-century head of state, running an entire country, looked backward at a 15th-century prince. The same prince this channel has spent 18 episodes documenting in exhaustive, honest, often uncomfortable detail, and saw something politically useful. Not a monster, a hero. And an entire state apparatus went to work making sure that's exactly how millions of people would come to see him. This is the documented story of how communist Romania, under Nicolae Ceausescu, rebuilt Vlad the Impaler into a national symbol, and what that rebuilding cost the actual complicated history this channel has been trying to protect since its very first episode. To understand why a 20th century government would reach 5 centuries backward for a hero, you have to understand the specific political position Romania occupied under Ceausescu's leadership. Romania, throughout the Cold War, existed within the Soviet-aligned Eastern Bloc. But Ceausescu's government, particularly from the late 1960s onward, cultivated a distinct, more independent-seeming nationalist posture within that alignment. Publicly resisting certain Soviet directions, emphasizing Romanian national identity and historical continuity, positioning the country's leadership as heirs to a long, proud, independent Romanian tradition. That kind of nationalist positioning needs symbols. Historical figures who can be presented as evidence that Romanian independence, Romanian resistance to foreign domination, wasn't a modern invention. It was ancient, proven, woven into the actual bloodline of the nation's history. This channel's first episode already gave you exactly the raw material such a project would need. A Wallachian prince who terrified the Ottoman Empire into retreat, who refused tribute, who built, quite literally, a monument out of defiance against a foreign power trying to dominate his small country. Strip away everything else this channel has carefully documented about impalement as domestic terror, about the Easter reckoning against his own nobility, about the brutality this channel has never once minimized, and what's left is a genuinely useful piece of nationalist iconography. A small nation's prince standing against a much larger empire and winning, at least for a while. By the 1970s, that raw material was about to get a very deliberate polish. The specific occasion, by most accounts, centered on the 500th anniversary of key events from Vlad's reign, falling, depending on which specific milestone was being marked, in the mid to late 1970s. Commemorative activity around this anniversary included official events, publications, and cultural production that reframed Vlad significantly, emphasizing his role as a defender of Wallachian sovereignty against Ottoman expansion, while minimizing or reframing the domestic brutality this channel has documented across multiple episodes as calculated terror against his own population. This wasn't subtle, and it wasn't accidental. State-sponsored historical narrative in this period generally favored figures who could be presented as embodying national continuity and resistance to foreign domination. Precisely the frame that made Vlad, selectively presented, genuinely useful. Popular historical fiction, film, and commemorative material from this era generally emphasized the anti-Ottoman military narrative this channel's first episode covered in detail. The Forest of Stakes reframed less as psychological terror and more as decisive, justified national defense. What generally received considerably less emphasis in this specific nationalist framing, the Easter reckoning against his own boyars, examined in this channel's third episode. The Brasov raids against Transylvanian Saxon merchants, examined in the fifth. The domestic terror that made even his own nobility calculate, repeatedly, whether loyalty was worth the risk. A complicated, genuinely terrifying historical figure was being carefully, deliberately simplified into something a national mythology could actually use. This channel has now shown you this exact process happen 4 separate times, in 4 completely different centuries. A monk, a poet, a king, a novelist, and now a modern nation-state, with considerably more resources than any of them. Here's the uncomfortable tension sitting at the center of this entire episode, and it's worth stating directly. Everything this channel has documented about Vlad's genuine, historically verified brutality, the mass impalement, the Easter feast that ended in execution and forced labor, the deliberate terror campaign against Brasov's merchants, remains true. None of that got erased by a 20th-century nationalist reframing. It just got quietly de-emphasized in favor of the parts of the story that served a different, more contemporary purpose. This is, in its own way, the mirror image of what this channel's 4th episode already showed you. King Matthias Corvinus needed Vlad to look like an irredeemable monster, to cover his own broken promise. So pamphlets exaggerated the brutality into something even worse than the documented reality. 500 years later, a different government needed Vlad to look like an uncomplicated hero, so official narrative de-emphasized exactly the same brutality in the opposite direction. Same man, same documented actions. 2 completely different political needs, 5 centuries apart, producing 2 completely different versions of him, both departing in their own ways from the messier, more honest history this channel has spent 18 episodes trying to actually protect. It's worth asking directly, is either version more wrong than the other? The monster pamphlets exaggerated cruelty that was, this channel has shown repeatedly, genuinely real. The hero narrative emphasized resistance that was also genuinely real. Neither invented anything from nothing. They just both, in their own era, for their own reasons, told you the half of the story that happened to be useful and left the rest in shadow. So here's where Season 3 actually begins. And here's what this specific chapter of the story quietly set in motion. The nationalist hero narrative built around Vlad in the 1970s didn't stay confined to official commemoration and state-sponsored culture. It became part of the broader cultural raw material later available to Romania's tourism industry, once the political conditions of the country changed considerably in the years that followed. A story this channel will follow directly in an upcoming chapter. A prince who was, at different points across 5 centuries, a hostage, a terrifying domestic tyrant, an anti-Ottoman defender, a manufactured monster, a Gothic novelist's borrowed name, and eventually, a state-sponsored national hero, became gradually something else entirely. A brand, available for whatever the next era needed him to be, exactly like every era before it. This channel spent Season 1 establishing who Vlad the Impaler actually was, in careful, documented detail. Season 2 spent 8 episodes showing you exactly how that man got reshaped, retold, and reinvented by nearly everyone who ever needed something from his story. Season 3 is where this channel finally steps all the way back and shows you what happens when an entire nation, and eventually an entire world, inherits a legend this useful, this flexible, and this endlessly reusable. Rivals, governments, tourism boards. The next storyteller is always waiting, and this channel is going to keep finding them. The forest that made an empire retreat, the grave still debated centuries later, the feast that became a reckoning, the ally who manufactured a monster, the raid that gave that monster its face, the river, the exile years, the final war, the cold case, the monk, the brother, the son, the signature, the diplomacy that failed, the face that may never have been his, the vampire that was never his either, the final hours. Everything Season 2 proved, and everything it honestly couldn't. And now, the dictator who needed a hero, and got one, 500 years after the man himself stopped having any say in the matter at all. Subscribe if you're ready to watch this story get bigger than any single century ever could hold it. Welcome to Season 3. We'll see you in the next chronicle.